Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 114 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight, well, we're going to be doing something very different from our usual episodes.
Indeed we are, and we'll head over to the more serious than usual common room in just a moment. But first, I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, Alan Sisto.
Thank you, Sean. Well, tonight we are addressing the challenging issue of race in Tolkien's works. But the way this episode came about and how you're getting to hear it now, well, that needs a little explanation.
As you hear us talk about nearly every episode, members of the Fellowship of the Podcast, that's the folks who support our show on Patreon, they get to hear a lot of exclusive content. There's short postscripts to each of our chapter-based walkthrough episodes, and we also have full-length quarterly episodes on special topics that are chosen by one of our patrons.
That's right. Well, in August of 2018, we approached one of those supporters, and we asked her if she had a topic in mind, and wow, did she ever.
Yeah.
We researched the topic, we hammered out an episode, and we released it in mid-October for our patrons.
But in the process of researching and recording the episode, we came to a realization. We realized that this topic was really just too important to limit it to the fewer than 200 people that we have as patrons. So we asked them, and you'll hear us do this at the end of the episode or near the end of the episode. We asked them if they would allow us to release it to the main feed.
Yeah. And you know, every single one of the folks who responded did so in the affirmative.
Yeah.
We even said, hey, folks, if you're afraid of saying that you don't want us to do that publicly, just PM me directly. And nobody did. So everybody who was responding to this really wanted this out there. We talked about how we have the best listeners around. Well, that may be doubly true of our patrons. We're grateful for their generosity in letting us release this episode. This was exclusive content that they contribute towards, but they're letting it out there for all of you to hear.
Yeah, and we'll come back to you at the end of the show again for an updated conclusion, so please be sure to stick around for that.
Yeah.
But before we do, we want to clarify a little bit about how we went about discussing this very important topic.
You know, honestly, when we did this, we had no idea that the question of race in Tolkien's works would end up becoming a hot topic again, as it has. If you're a fan of Tolkien and you have any kind of exposure to the social media sphere surrounding Tolkien's works, you saw that this topic ended up making the rounds again as recently as December of 2018.
So much so that one of our primary sources for researching this episode, Dr. Dimitra Fimi, has actually stepped back into the discussion with a new look at race in Tolkien's Legendarium. She's published it on her blog. She's also published shorter articles in other places online, but I would definitely recommend checking out her blog. The essay there is titled Revisiting Race in Tolkien's Legendarium, Constructing Cultures and Ideologies in an Imaginary World. Now, we'll put a link to that in our show notes, and I highly recommend reading it as a postscript to this episode.
Absolutely. And it's important to keep in mind that, as we always do at the Prancing Pony Podcast, we approach this subject from the standpoint of trying to understand Tolkien's intentions in writing the work. That is, based on Tolkien's written works, letters, and his biography, should we read any racist intentions into his work, as some have claimed?
And I hope you'll find that we've answered that question. I think we have, as well as we could.
Yeah.
However, one thing that we have not done yet is reach out to readers in populations that typically experience racism and ask them how they react to Tolkien's work. Some of our listeners who have heard this episode already have suggested that this is probably the logical next step, and I agree with that. I think that would be, the next place to go with this discussion.
Absolutely. Now, we haven't done it because, simply put, we're trying to start a conversation with this episode, not end one.
Yeah, and as Tolkien himself said, applicability resides in the freedom of the reader. We've done our best with a difficult topic, working with the words Tolkien left behind and what we know of his life and our own experience, and we invite you to listen and let us know what you think.
Yeah.
So with that, let's jump into our Patreon special on race in Tolkien.
Well, folks, welcome to our third patron-exclusive special for 2018. Every quarter, we do a special on a topic that goes beyond our usual reading and discussion episodes, and it's available only to members of the Fellowship of the Podcast. That's you, our patrons. Just a little extra value for those of you who give us your support on Patreon.
Now, the topics for these quarterly specials are chosen by our patrons at the Círdan's contribution tier. Today, we have a topic from Tamsin in Minnesota, and as Alan said a moment ago, it is a serious one. Tamsin wrote into us with this. She said, a few weeks ago, I was reading an article in a major American newspaper about a man who was one of the founders and editors of a white nationalist website. There was a list of books which they encourage their followers to read, which support their point of view of white superiority, and on the list was The Lord of the Rings. Of course, I was heartsick when I read that, she says, and it made my skin crawl, and I became angry. Since that time, I've been trying to counter the white nationalist claim and any justification they use to further their cause that in any way involves Tolkien.
Yeah, well, I can't blame her.
No, I certainly can't.
Yeah.
And yeah, it would be
it is
very,
like a gut punch,
reading
something like that
really
is like,
yeah.
what?
Of a work that is very important to you, as important as this work is to us, to read that.
It's like a personal assault in a way.
Yeah.
It's hard not to take it personally, isn't it? Even though I didn't write it.
Right. Yeah, it really is. And, we've all seen articles like that. I don't think I've ever seen anything, quite like that. But, I can imagine what this must have done to her. I can tell you what it did to me when I read her message to us.
Absolutely. Me too. Well, Tamsin knows it's a challenging topic, but she suggests that it's one that we need to address. After all, in the novels, on the surface, you can see that all the good guys are white and all the bad guys maybe nearly all the bad guys are described as dark-skinned. And then, of course, there's all the Nordic and Teutonic admiration that Tolkien had, which could confuse a casual reader. So when we first received this message, man, I got to tell you, we went back. Well, I'm not going to say we went back and forth because we never really ever thought no.
We never entertained the idea of not doing it, but we did go back and forth quite a bit about how to do it before telling her yes.
Exactly. And kind of, calculating the risks and realizing that, we're opening a can of worms here. And there might be some people out there who disagree with our take on this, and we might even bother those people. And frankly, I actually don't care. That's a horrible thing to say, but it's true. Given where we land on this, but
I think we should be clear in saying that. I mean, we don't care if we offend anybody who
subscribe to those,
who subscribes to those ideologies and likes Lord of the Rings because of that.
Yeah, let's be clear. Clear. If the reason you like Lord of the Rings is because it helps support your view of white superiority,
your ideology of hate, then
You can listen to another podcast because you're not going to listen to us anymore.
Right.
You're not going to want to actually after the show.
Not after today. No.
So, we knew that this was going to be a tough episode to research and produce because of the content and the amount of material out there. But we also knew that it would be a really important one.
Yeah, it is. And I think we can probably all think back to some time where we've seen or heard someone accuse Tolkien or his work of racism, or at least of there being some hidden racist meaning to it.
Every couple of weeks on a Facebook group. I mean, really.
It really is true.
It comes up a lot.
It's sad to say, but it does come up a lot. And I think we can prove very quickly that, the idea that Tolkien had any overt racist content in his work, or any covert even racist content in his work, is not correct. Right. And frankly, it is upsetting to me as a lover of his work to see people misunderstand it that way or use it to promote these kinds of ideologies.
Right.
But what about people who are fans? I mean, maybe you're a reader who's, picked up on some aspects of the work that do seem troubling by today's standards. There are some things there that that maybe make you question, well, where did Tolkien really stand on the issue of race?
Exactly.
And maybe you've got some questions about that. And hopefully we'll help make those things clear in this episode.
Well, that's the idea.
That is the idea. We're going to try. Now, to be fair, I mean, the charges of outright racism usually come from either someone in the media or some literary critic who doesn't understand it, probably hasn't even read it, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Or has only read a snippet or two,
or has even only seen the movies. I mean, I saw articles that, tried to condemn Tolkien's work on the basis of things that were in the movies. And
right.
When I say that, I'm certainly not accusing Peter Jackson of any racist content either. No. It's just, all their examples came from the movies. So there's definitely an understanding gap there. Let's put it that way.
Yes, there is. That's true.
And
the knowledge gap.
It might be easier for us to just ignore it or laugh it off as a silly misunderstanding, but that doesn't stop the idea from spreading. And so our goal here today is to arm you as a reader and a fan with some information that will hopefully help you make sense of all this.
Yeah. Like you, Sean, I get frustrated and even angry when I hear people claim that Tolkien was a racist. I can't imagine, though, how much angrier I'd be if I heard somebody try to use Tolkien's works to justify their own racism. This really is a problematic topic. It's not an easy one to talk about. Like you said, it might be easier to just ignore it rather than risk kicking over a hornet's nest. But, the fact is, when this question was brought to us, we thought long and hard and decided we wanted to take this opportunity to talk about it. And we just hope we'll manage to do the topic justice.
So bring on the hornets, I guess is what we're saying. I mean, we're going to do our best. I should warn folks listening that we are going to be speaking very frankly about a very difficult subject that Alan and I are both really passionate about. We are not going to tiptoe around it. I think it deserves better than that. I think we're all adults here. And
I'm not very good at tiptoeing, you might have noticed.
I have noticed that. I think that, we're, for the most part, we're all grown-ups in the room, and I think that we can have an honest conversation about this without tiptoeing around things.
Right.
Again, I think I said this already. I am personally offended by the accusation that Lord of the Rings, a work that means so much to me, could have racist content in it, and that I'm somehow naive or complicit, for not seeing it.
Well, and that's the conclusion. If indeed it does have it, and you
Exactly.
think it doesn't, then that's the logical end. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But I also recognize that, as a white male, I come at this work from a different perspective than some others. And so I'm going to try and keep that in mind too. I guess what I'm trying to say here is we're going to do our best to remain objective about this, but we are going to be honest.
Yeah.
And I would say that if this topic is especially distressing to anybody out there, we'll certainly understand if you decide to just skip past it and not listen to it. But I will ask,
other content. Yeah.
There's plenty of other content out there, but I will ask, as our sort of the members of the fellowship of the podcast, we will ask that you do listen to it because we want to make you think.
Yeah. And we also want you to reach out to us after listening and let us know how we did. Really appreciate that feedback.
Yes, we would. Well, why don't we go ahead and start by talking about some of the sources that we've referenced in preparing for this episode. And to be honest with you, not a whole lot of our usual scholars have given much attention to this. And I suspect that many of them probably feel that the claims of racism are baseless and not worth dignifying with a response.
Sure.
And while that attitude may be defensible and they may have a point, it does kind of leave us without a whole lot of ammunition with which to fire back at the accusations.
Sure.
Of the many scholars that we've referenced before on the show, the one who's really done some work on this that we found is Dimitra Fimi. She devoted a chapter to race in her book, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History. A lot of our episode research actually came from that book, and so we're definitely indebted to her for that.
But to be fair, the scope of that book is, and I'm going to quote her book here, to examine Tolkien's work from a historical perspective, showing how it relates to his own time, end quote. So her chapter on this topic is much more focused on placing Tolkien's Legendarium within the context of anthropological and popular ideas about race of the early 20th century. Now, that's a very informative context and it's very helpful, but it doesn't directly come out and answer the question of whether Tolkien can be charged with racism or whether his works reflect racist attitudes. And that's another quote from Fimi. She actually chooses to shy away from this question, saying, and again, another quote, racism as a concept deserving of ideological questioning is a later construct. Such questions could only be treated within the framework of modern perspectives on racism and racial discrimination.
So in other words, her point is basically Tolkien in his own time, not Tolkien through the lens of our modern attitudes towards race. So for that reason, I think that's exactly why she doesn't touch that latter question. Yeah. She did point to a couple of other scholars who have approached the subject, quoting Dr. Fimi, with varying levels of success. And we did take a look at some... That's a gentle
way of putting it. Very gentle way of putting it.
And we did take a look at some of the scholars she pointed to, and we did find some useful stuff in a couple of places that she pointed to. One is a book called Defending Middle-earth, Tolkien, Myth, and Modernity by Patrick Curry. Now, that's a name that I knew. We haven't really talked about him before on the show, but I knew his name as a contributor to Michael Drout's J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia.
I thought the name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place him.
Yeah. So he's got a book that has a chapter, a few pages on this topic. There's also an interesting article by someone named Anderson Rierich III in Modern Fiction Studies called "Why is the Only Good Orc a Dead Orc?"
I like that title.
Yeah.
But Fimi makes a good point. Any attempt to try and dispel accusations of racism or even racialist content in the Legendarium always looks at it from a modern perspective, and that requires reading a lot into what Tolkien said.
Yeah.
To the extent that that's possible, we'd rather not do that, just as she tried to not do that. We want to focus on Tolkien in his own time and in his own words as much as possible. So we're going to be relying a lot on the letters and the text itself.
And I think that's the only fair way to do it, isn't it? I think it's the only objective way is to look at his words in the book and in his letters and, put that in context where needed.
Exactly.
Well, with that said, Alan, why don't we go ahead and start with a quick rundown of some of the problems that people see in Tolkien's work that have
Okay.
either been seen as being racist or having racial overtones.
I think that's a good starting point. Yeah.
And I think the first one is this idea of the Northern spirit. Tolkien's own words that he used in at least one letter. And obviously, I mean, we've talked about this quite a few times on the podcast. Tolkien embraced the languages and the cultures of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, England, and so on. And he did so in the early 20th century, which really was a time when people were still primarily interested, as I think you could probably say they have been for centuries, primarily in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. Tolkien was always sort of going against the popular trend by championing these Germanic ideals, which we talk about a lot on the show.
Yeah, we do. I mean, as recently as episode 92, we talked about the Beowulf essay, and that is full of references to the great northern virtues, northern courage, the strength of the northern mythological imagination. And then, of course, you can remember the famous letter that we reference every single time, practically, the letter to Milton Waldman, 131.
It's what keeps us going.
That's right. In which he said that he wanted his mythology to be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East. I mean, he specifically calls out it's not Rome or Greece.
Right.
Which is pretty obvious.
Right.
Now, on the surface, some of these comments do sound a little bit like some of the comments that you might hear made by white supremacists about that northern spirit. But you've got to keep in mind that Tolkien here is talking about culture. He's talking about language, mythology, and literature. He is not talking about ethnicity.
No, and that's true. I mean, and I think that's always been his MO. I think we've seen that time and time again in the work. Tolkien really believed that language, not ethnicity or not race, whatever you want to call that, was the primary mark of culture. He even said this in his lecture, English and Welsh. He said, "For though cultural and other traditions may accompany a difference of language, they are chiefly maintained and preserved by language. Language is the prime differentiator of peoples, not of races, whatever that much misused word may mean in the long blended history of Western Europe."
Wow.
And I think that's a really telling quote. There's so much there that you really have to unpack and understand. I mean, I think you get a lot about Tolkien's idea of race and the significance of race, or the insignificance of race, really.
Right.
Because
you're right. It's the insignificance. Yeah.
He says it is language that is the main differentiator of peoples. It's language that's that cultural marker, not.
And we see that even in his works, don't we? I mean, it makes me think immediately of Thingol banning the Noldor tongue.
The Quenya language. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And sort of, it was sort of an attack on the Noldor, really.
Right.
Attack on their culture. Yeah.
It had nothing to do with their physical appearance, the fact that maybe they had light coming from their eyes or whatever the Noldor had that was physically distinct. It had nothing to do with that, and it had everything to do with their language. It was an attempt to shut a people down through language. And we see that sort of thing happen throughout the works, that indeed language is what distinguishes one group of people from another.
I think you can even see it as recently as some of the stuff we've been talking about with the hobbits living in Eriador. One of the things that has been occurring to me is the idea that the hobbits settled in the Shire and they adopted the Westron tongue, and they accepted the king in Arthedain as as their ruler, and they effectively became culturally Westron, I guess. They're not quite Dunedain, I suppose, but they sort of became culturally that way. Aren't
you a little short for the Dunedain?
I'm Frodo Baggins. I'm here to rescue you.
That may be our only joke for the night, folks. So
it might be. And there you go. There's your Star Wars reference. I mean, I feel like the hobbits really sort of, they accept all this Dunedain culture, and they become, they sort of become enlightened by it, despite the fact that they are very ethnically distinct. Physical appearance and everything is all very different, but culturally they're related to them, and I think that's really significant.
I think it is,
and I think that Tolkien has this concept in here that this is a much misused word. Race is a much misused word.
I wanted to touch on that. Yeah,
obviously, by the time he's writing this, I think that essay was written in the 1950s, wasn't it? It was 1955.
I believe so. English and Welsh.
Yeah. That was a late one. And so by the time he got around to writing that word race had been just dragged through the mire for the last couple of decades.
Yes, it had.
And so I think he recognized that, and I think he spoke to that. And I think this idea of a long blended history of Western Europe. I mean, I think he's pointing to the fact that European culture and European history and European ethnicity is blended, and it has been blended
very
for
much.
centuries.
I mean, when you realize the English-speaking peoples, in England, who he would call the English people, are what ethnically? They are a combination of Anglo-Saxon, of Celts, of Normans, and of Vikings. I mean, they're not ethnically what they once were, but they are linguistically what they once were, and it's the language that binds them. Yeah,
it's the language that defines that, and so I think that's really key, and I think that's a good quote to spend a little time on, and I'm glad we've done that.
It is, and I have to say, just on a personal note, I agree with him that race is a misused word. I know it's a convenient shorthand, and I use it too, but I suppose I like to think of things, and maybe I'm just completely ignorant on this, and I could be. So I'm not going to pretend that I know more than anybody else. But I think of all of humanity as the human race, and I see ethnicities. Of course, I'm not stupid. I'm not naive. I recognize that there are different genetic heritages, all around the world, and that these ethnicities are what they are, and they are distinct, and they each have particular values. But we're all the human race, which is so distinct from Tolkien's world, where the races really are separate races. I mean, the elves and the dwarves, never the twain shall meet, despite Jackson's. Anyway, we're not going there.
Right. Well, it doesn't even say, I mean, he says elves and men. I think, what's the letter where he talks about elves and men? And we always say elves and men are basically the same species, but I think Tolkien says in one of his letters that elves and men are evidently one race, or else they could not.
They wouldn't be able to reproduce.
They wouldn't be able to reproduce.
Well, they wouldn't be able to reproduce with fertile offspring, right?
It would
be like mules.
Yeah, they'd be mules. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that Tolkien doesn't seem to have really placed a whole lot of stock in this word race. He does use it a few times in the Legendarium to refer to, like you said, elves versus dwarves or men. He'll talk about
the race of Numenorians.
The races of Middle-earth. Yeah. But he just as often just refers to the peoples, the peoples of Middle-earth. Well, that's the title of a volume of History of Middle-earth.
Yes, it is.
So he does use other words too. And I think he recognized that it was a challenging word, and I think he didn't want to put too much stock into it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, these aren't the comments of a man with racist leanings. These are the words of somebody who believes that race is less relevant to a culture than languages, which we've talked about. Then he recognizes that the history of Europe is one of blended peoples, ethnically speaking. And then he also realizes the word race has been misused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. With all that said, we do see this sort of extolling of the Northwest. We do see that for the most part in the Legendarium. I mean, we do see that the good guys live in the Northwest of Middle-earth. In fact, the Northwest is the only part we know enough about to have a map of it, right?
That's true.
We don't have any information about the geography of, Far-Harad or Hrun or Khan. And yes, the farther west you go, the more enlightened you get. Valinor is in the uttermost west.
Right.
Tol Eressëa is a step down that's just east of that. And then Numenor was just east of that. And that was as far advanced as men were ever allowed to go, both geographically west and culturally enlightened.
Good point.
And west is the direction of goodness and virtue and holiness, and east is the direction from which evil and darkness comes. You can't deny that. Remember the funeral dirge that Aragorn and Legolas sing for Boromir and Two Towers. Remember Gimli, he refuses to sing about the east wind, and Aragorn says, no, that is as it should be, said Aragorn. It says, in Minas Tirith they endure the east wind, but they do not ask it for tidings.
And they certainly don't want a dwarf singing about it.
Right.
I don't need to hear that.
It's got to be a bad omen to sing about the east wind. You can probably imagine.
It would be. Absolutely. Now, I admit, that all does seem a bit West-centric, but again, these are cultural markers. Nothing in the text says that people born in the West are better in any way than people born elsewhere. In fact, we learned that elves, men, and dwarves all started out in the eastern parts of Middle-earth. All the good ones that we care about are the ones that moved west into the map that we're familiar with. So it's got nothing to do with with ethnicity, and it's got everything to do in this case with moving towards Valinor.
With
and wherever you happen
culture
to
and
place-
with moving towards where
Towards
the
the
light
light,
comes
yeah.
from. Yeah, and
Exactly.
that light is a very literal light, that they're traveling towards.
Quite
So
literal.
much so that when men awoke, the sun was actually rising in the west, because Tolkien wanted following that light to be a really literal concept as opposed to a more figurative concept that could maybe
Boy, and that must
be
have been
misinterpreted.
confusing the next time when it rose in the east. Like,
Hey,
wait a
didn't
minute.
that used to be over
Didn't
there?
It used to be there in the morning. Is it nighttime now? I'm confused.
Yeah.
And we recently discussed how hobbits migrated from the east and quickly attained that high level of civilization, like you suggested earlier. That's partly due to their contact with the Dunedain.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let's see. We were just talking about Gimli. I mean, I guess the next thing that we probably should touch on is dwarves and some of the accusations that dwarves are based on anti-Semitic stereotypes. There's things like the love of gold, which I would argue is a trait that's not limited to dwarves.
Right.
Or even something as ridiculous as like Fili's long nose. I mean, I've actually heard people say that's an anti-Semitic concept. Yes, I have. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I had not actually heard that one.
Yeah.
What about Gandalf's bushy eyebrows? Is that a particular
that's
slam?
just it. I mean, if you look hard enough, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I mean, if you look hard enough, you can see any physical trait and try and read something into it that's really not there.
Exactly.
But yeah, we've certainly heard that about dwarves. And I guess the big one, and I think the one that you kind of continually hear over and over again, is the idea that orcs and evil men are described as not white. They're either swart is a word that Tolkien likes to use, which is an archaic word that means dark in color or dark skinned or swarthy.
Swarthy,
or swarthy. He does use the adjective swarthy sometimes, which is, I guess, a little bit more familiar adjective. He'll use things like squint-eyed or sallow, which is another archaic word that means yellow or brownish yellow. If you put those two descriptors together, you come up with something pretty unpleasant. But
that's true.
And so that is there. And we'll talk about that.
We'll talk more about it exactly as we progress into the show. We'll touch on each of those. Now, like we said, some of this stuff does seem troubling, especially at first glance, when we view it in terms of our modern attitudes about race, and especially our modern language and terminology about race. But we really do need to acknowledge that Tolkien lived in a different time than we do. Now, that doesn't justify living in a different time doesn't justify wrong actions or wrong.
No, it doesn't justify.
But it changes
doesn't
the
justify
words.
Racism if it's there.
Right, but it does change the words that are available to somebody and the meaning of the words that are used. So he started writing the Legendarium 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. Certainly nobody can deny the 20th century was a very tumultuous time for issues regarding race all around the world.
Yeah, that's true. And I think you hit on something which is really important, which is in the early part of the 20th century when he was writing this, the language to talk about race and ethnicity that we have today, it just wasn't there. It wasn't available. And so Tolkien had to use the language that was available to him. He was not the only author who did so. I mean, you can, if you read any work of literature, watch movies, watch TV, watch old cartoons from the early part of the 20th century, you can see all sort of really hard to watch content. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that we watch it now and we just think, holy cow, how did they make this for kids? How did they make this for anybody? How did anybody think this was entertaining? But it's just, they didn't really have the language, and to some degree, they didn't really have the apparatus for evaluating those things the way we do today.
That's right.
And I'm not saying that would absolve Tolkien, but I would say but I would say that we do need to kind of view him in his own time. And I think that if there's a reason why Tolkien's work seems to, seems to hit us a little harder than some of that other stuff, I think it might just be because people still read his work and they still read it as a contemporary work of fiction, which
that's right.
To be fair, it's not. I mean, it's a book that's, The Hobbit's 80 years old. I mean,
right. Yeah.
So
Lord of the Rings is over 60 years old now.
Right. So, none of that means that we can't judge Tolkien's work through a modern lens or apply modern values to it. I mean, we can, and I would argue that we should. We should be able to look at a work of literature from an earlier time and determine how well it holds up to modern values and, talk about it when it doesn't meet our current standards.
Agreed. But if we do that, we have to be fair. We have to take it on its own terms.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if we want to see it with a modern eye, we have to consider it in the context of the culture that it came from and of the individual that it came from.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's where understanding that historical and that cultural context Tolkien was coming from really helps us understand the words on the page better.
Yeah.
The meanings of words really do change over time, and the baggage
Yeah.
associated with those words changes over time. And
Significantly.
so I think we really have to take a close look at the language Tolkien uses if we want to really try and understand his intentions.
Yeah. And, you know, just as we have to look closely at the language he uses, we also have to look very closely at Tolkien himself in order to understand those intentions. And to do that, we have to understand what his attitude was towards his own time.
Yeah.
Was he a fairly typical Englishman of his day with the same perspectives and biases that we might expect from anybody else? Or was he, more educated, more enlightened, if you want to come up with a word? And again, by as objective a standards we can come up with.
Sure.
And that's frankly why Dr. Fimi's analysis is so good for this, and really, as a starting point, helped us to kind of put a framework on this.
Yeah, it really kind of helps us establish Tolkien in his time and his place. And I think the first thing we need to talk about on that topic is, acknowledge the fact that, as we've just been sort of talking about, that in Tolkien's time, people didn't necessarily have the same reactions to the same ideas about race that we have today. Some people might say that we're more aware of racial injustices and inequality, more aware of racism in general, or maybe that we just pay more attention to the way we talk about race. Some people might also say we've got a long way to go, and I wouldn't argue with that. I think we've got a very long way to go.
There's plenty of evidence for that.
As a society. Yeah. We may have progressed, but we're still not there yet.
Right.
But I guess that's another story. I think one thing should be obvious. In Tolkien's time, attitudes were different, weren't they?
Yeah, different. That's a good way of putting it. Dimitra Fimi points out, and again, here's a quick quote, "It was not until after World War II that a greater awareness of racial offensiveness was expressed in Britain, mainly by humanitarians and liberals, in contrast to the USA, where racism became a political issue much earlier due to particular historical circumstances," end quote. I guess that's her gentle way of reminding us of the war between the states.
Yeah, right.
I think is the particular historical circumstances that she's discussing.
I'm sure, yeah.
And everything
that came after it, the Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Poll taxes and
yeah.
And I think that's something we need to keep in mind on this side of the pond. Each country, each nation has its own racial baggage to deal with. We need to remember that Tolkien's experience as an Englishman born around the turn of the century was very different from ours.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
we really should start with his birth, which, of course, as we've talked about before, was not in England, but in South Africa in 1892.
And that's just a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
Yeah,
because,
isn't it?
I mean, I don't know about you, Alan, but for me, I grew up in the 1980s, and for me growing up, the place on the world map that I most associated with racial inequality was South Africa. I know some of our younger listeners may thankfully not remember this, but in the 1980s, they still had apartheid in place, which was, basically an institutionalized policy of segregation. The white minority in the country, the settlers from Europe, the Dutch and the English and others, consolidated the power and the wealth at the expense of people of color and the Black African natives and others. Now, apartheid wasn't actually institutionalized, the internet tells me, until 1948. Now, that's
Thank you, Internet.
That's over 50 years after Tolkien's early childhood there.
Yeah.
And then it was abolished in the early 1990s. But come on, we know these things don't just happen overnight. The racial inequalities that led to apartheid as a matter of policy,
as a system, right?
As a system, were in place a long time before 1948, and as I understand it, they're still being dealt with today. But I digress. Tolkien did have some comments on the racial situation in South Africa that he sent to his son Christopher. That was in a letter in the 1940s, which I think we've talked about before on the show, and we'll come back to it in a moment.
We will.
But I guess right now, let's see, what are some of the other problems in the 20th century that we've got here on our list?
Well, Tolkien was back in England by the time he was 3 years old, but even Britain then had its share of troubling racial ideologies. This was a time when it was still perfectly acceptable, even among scientists, to say that different physical characteristics of ethnic groups meant that they had different mental abilities. The racial anthropology of the time actually had educated people, believing things like the shape of a person's skull or their skin color was proof that they were less evolved than white Europeans.
Yeah.
I mean, stunning. But
this was common. This was common.
Exactly.
This was I'm making air quotes again, and I love to do that.
Common knowledge.
This is
quote,
common
unquote.
knowledge. This was the educated position on racial anthropology.
Absolutely the educated position. And then in the first 10 years of the 20th century, eugenics began to become popular, both in Britain and America. And of course, that was an idea that would take a very long time to die, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But this was the idea that unfit races would be eliminated by nature as a result of evolution, but that the white race should hedge their bets by reproducing faster than the unfit. And of course, even in some places, the decision was made to sterilize certain unfit people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fortunately, there is zero evidence that Tolkien ever bought into any of these ideas, and a great deal of evidence that he didn't. But he would have been surrounded by this stuff throughout his life. These theories remained popular in Britain and in America all the way through the early 20th century until the 1930s, when people started to see how Nazi Germany was taking these ideas to the extreme.
And that brings us to Nazi Germany, and I don't think that,
of course,
at the risk of invoking Godwin's law, I don't think that any discussion about race
Godwin's law,
I don't think any discussion about race in the 20th century would be complete without bringing Hitler into the conversation.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Obviously, we don't have to tell anyone what happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945, nor do we have to tell you about how really all of Europe was impacted by it. All the world was impacted by it, including Tolkien, and we will get to that soon.
Yeah, and if we do have to tell you, just look it up on the internet. Wiki that, please.
Yeah.
Anyway, with all that aside, and that's a lot to set aside, it is interesting and more than a little disappointing to point out that Tolkien's academic field, philology, and Nazi propaganda both had some favorite books in common.
Yeah,
now,
that's true.
That's not really a shock given the fact that philology was a very German field of study at the time.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Hitler and the Nazis were all about extolling the greatness of the German people, so they often turned to mythology and folklore for their imagery. Well, Hitler frequently used Norse and Germanic myths, folk tales, even things like the work of the Brothers Grimm as Nazi propaganda.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about that is, we talked about this with Tom Shippey in episode 91, the fact that the Grimm's work started out as a philological work. They were collecting stories as part of a philological study in an attempt to find a common language and a common culture of the German people at a time when there was really not an idea of a German people. And they were part of this growing trend of German identity and German nationalism in the 19th century that I think I really should probably call romantic nationalism, because I think it's separated from later German nationalism for fairly obvious reasons, because of what the Nazis did to that phrase. But this idea of romantic nationalism, it was a positive force when the Grimms were doing it, as it was a force for unification and democratization. It wasn't until later that it turned into this more sinister kind of nationalism that eventually led to the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
I'd even point out that the term Aryan, which the Nazis loved to use as a racial term, that implied white superiority over other races. The idea of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, master race. Aryan actually started as a linguistic term with its roots in Indo-European language studies. It wasn't a racial term at all. But they used it as one, and well, more on that in a moment.
Well, yeah, Tolkien had some. He straightened him out on that.
He had some comments on that. Yeah,
you'd think he would. You'd think he would, and he did. That's a brief and admittedly way too brief overview of some of the racial problems and issues that Tolkien would have been affected by during his life as a white man in the 20th century. You'll notice we've not said anything really about the wretched state of affairs in the United States in the 20th century. But that's because Tolkien doesn't have anything to say about it in his letters. He's an Englishman. He never visited America. He certainly didn't have access to the global communication that we have today. He wasn't, on Facebook checking his news feed for the latest from the United States. It simply wouldn't have affected him directly.
Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised to not hear him speaking out about it. Although, from his letters where he did talk about racial issues of his day, I think we can.
We could draw some conclusions.
We can draw some conclusions about what he would think about it. Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, with all that said, so I think we've established that there was a lot going on in the 20th century, a lot of problems that Tolkien was surrounded by. With all that said, and I want to quote one of our sources here. This is the article by that Rierick, the author Rierick that I mentioned a moment ago, in saying that living in a racist society does not predestine one to be racist.
Ah, good point.
just because he lived in this society does not mean that we should assume Tolkien ascribed to any of these beliefs, that any of this stuff was in his heart. And especially we will find that there are lots of reasons to believe that it did not.
That's correct. Yeah.
I would say that even if we decided to cut Tolkien a little bit of slack for living in a more racist time than we live in today. No, sorry, I'm not going to say that. A more overtly racist time than we live in today.
That's a better way of putting it, isn't it?
But even if we decide to cut Tolkien some slack for living when he did, I still think he comes across as pretty enlightened for his time. Based on the things that he wrote in his letters, we can see that he did have a negative reaction to many of the most troubling racial issues of his day.
You're right. Dimitra Fimi agrees. In her text, she says that the glimpses we have into Tolkien's thoughts and ideas on race in later years, mainly through his letters and scholarly work, show a different historical context from what the major racist trends of his day would show. By the time of the ominous rise of Nazi Germany and the atrocities of World War II, Tolkien, as many of his contemporaries, could see where the ideological implications of racial anthropology might lead. He spoke openly against Nazi ideas and even cautioned his colleagues against the use of the term race itself.
Well, there you go. As usual, Dimitra Fimi said it better. Said it better than we did.
There's a shocker.
Yeah. Now, obviously, for Tolkien to have believed that Adolf Hitler was a monster doesn't seem like a particularly,
well, yeah,
it's not a particularly enlightened view to us now because it's generally accepted
obvious
that
monster
he was.
is obvious monster.
Right. I think we all can pretty much agree on the fact that Hitler was a monster.
There's a reason you don't want anybody to compare. The reason why the Godwin's law is there,
right,
is because it's inappropriate to compare anybody to Hitler.
Comparing anybody to Hitler is an instant, an instant conversation killer. But even though that is common knowledge now, not everyone in Europe was prepared to say that at the time.
No, you're right.
Britain's own Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, in 1938, it was what was it now? It was the Munich Agreement, right? I think is what it's called.
Yep.
In 1938, he championed that to basically appease Hitler. 1938. Here's what Tolkien was saying.
You have Czechoslovakia. You go ahead. That's okay.
Yeah, you just take it. It's fine. And it was an attempt to appease Hitler, thinking, let's just give him what he wants, and maybe we'll avoid war.
Right.
Well, here's what Tolkien was saying about the Nazis in 1938, the same year that Prime Minister Chamberlain was advocating for appeasing Hitler. So a German publishing house called, let me see if I can get this right, Rooten and Learning.
And Learning. Yeah, that's pretty close. I think you got it.
All right. Good deal. It's a German publishing house that had once been owned by German Jews, but was forcibly sold to Aryan owners in 1936, because that's the kind of stuff that was going on at the time.
Yep. Yes, it was.
This publishing house was negotiating with Allen and Unwin to try and get a German edition of The Hobbit out there. But before they did that, they wrote to Tolkien asking him to confirm that he was of Irish or Aryan origin.
Tolkien wrote back to Stanley Unwin very indignantly in July of 1938. This was 2 months before Chamberlain's infamous and short-lived peace accord with Hitler. And this is from letter 29. Do I suffer this impertinence because of the possession of a German name? Or do their lunatic laws require a certificate of Irish origin from all persons of all countries? Personally, I should be inclined to refuse to give any Bestätigung, that's German for confirmation, although it happens that I can, and let a German translation go hang. In any case, I should object strongly to any such declaration appearing in print. I do not regard the probable absence of all Jewish blood as necessarily honorable, and I have many Jewish friends, and should regret giving any color to the notion that I subscribe to the wholly pernicious and unscientific race doctrine. Kudos, Tolkien.
Tolkien
Kudos.
1, Nazi 0.
Nazi 0. Well, just wait. The score's not done yet. He included 2 responses to the publisher and told Stanley Unwin, you send the one you want. I'm sure neither one of them was very polite, but we don't know for sure which draft was sent because only one was preserved in the Allen and Unwin archives, which shows up as letter number 30. So Carpenter concludes that Unwin sent the other one. Not a bad decision.
Yep.
The one that's printed, which maybe this was the more inflammatory one. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I love it, though. It tells us what he really thought.
It is great. Yeah, it is great.
In typical Toller's style. Here, if I can get through it. Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Irish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is, Indo-Iranian, As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. In other words, here he is giving a philology
lesson to the Nazis, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he continues, he says, but if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. My great-great-grandfather came to England in the 18th century from Germany. The main part of my descent is therefore purely English, and I am an English subject, which should be sufficient. I have been accustomed nonetheless to regard my German name with pride, and continue to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride. Oh man.
Tolkien.
Zing.
That was a 3-pointer. I'm going to give him. I'm going to say Tolkien 4, Nazis 0 for that one.
Seriously, that's brilliantly done.
Yeah, and I love the little philology lesson in there.
Oh, I know. Like
Tolkien,
Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or related dialects. That's Aryan for you right there.
And that's just it. Tolkien understood the meaning of the term Aryan better than the Nazis did. He knew it was a linguistic and a cultural term, not a racial one. For the Indo-Iranian people, the Indo-European
language. They had perverted
speakers.
it. The Nazis had perverted it to make it a racial one, but it was never a racial distinction. Right.
Right. And he knew that it was basically a linguistic term for the people of modern day India and Iran. Now, actually, it wasn't the Nazis who first perverted it. It was actually a prominent 19th century racism. This is a guy I've heard called sort of the father of modern racism, or the father of modern racialist theory, which there's a title.
There's something you don't want to be.
Yeah, no kidding. He probably did want to be.
Goodness.
But he was a French writer named Joseph Arthur de Gobineau. And he first made the claim that these Aryans of India and Iran were blonde Northern Europeans who migrated across Europe and Asia. Now, I don't know how familiar Tolkien was with Gobineau's work. It has been, needless to say, widely discredited. And nobody, I mean, everybody, he was just making this stuff up.
It sounds like it.
And it's
whole cloth, just
yeah, exactly. Well, it just sounds like you're trying to create something in prehistory to say that your race is better than other races, basically. Just a bald-faced lie, basically.
Yeah.
And I think it's very clear, even though we don't really know how familiar Tolkien was with Gobineau's work, there's no evidence to suggest that he read it, I believe, from reading Fimi. But it's very clear from this letter that Tolkien would have said he had no idea what he was talking about.
You were an idiot, sir.
Yeah, exactly. And I love this letter because it's such a great example of one of my favorite debate tactics, which is playing dumb but smarter than you. So, yeah. Really great stuff there from Tolkien.
That really is. Well, a few years later in 1941, Tolkien wrote a letter to his son, Michael. Now, this shows up in the volume of letters as number 45. At this point, Michael was an officer cadet at the Royal Military College. Now, in this letter, Tolkien shared some thoughts on the war, Hitler, and Nazi propaganda about the Germanic ideal. He called Hitler, quote, a man inspired by a mad whirlwind devil that makes the poor old Kaiser look like an old woman knitting. Which, again, talk about a way with words.
Yeah.
He went on to say, I have spent most of my life since I was your age studying Germanic matters, in the general sense that includes England and Scandinavia. There is a great deal more force and truth than ignorant people imagine in the Germanic ideal. I was much attracted by it as an undergraduate, when Hitler was, I suppose, dabbling in paint and had not heard of it. I mean, maybe I'm reading this wrong with my tone, but
you're reading
it
right perfectly. You're reading it perfectly.
So he goes on and says, I know better than most what is the truth about this Nordic nonsense. Anyway, I have in this war a burning private grudge, which would probably make me a better soldier at 49 than I was at 22, against that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler. For the odd thing about demonic inspiration and impetus is that in no way enhances the purely intellectual stature. It chiefly affects the mere will. Ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Well done, sir.
Indiana Jones was not the only college professor to stick it to the Nazis.
And not the first.
And not the first.
As Mandos might say, not the first.
Not the first. That last comment, I think, should tell us a lot about what Tolkien was trying to do. He was trying to reclaim the Germanic tradition, that northern spirit that he loved. He was trying to take it back from people like Hitler who were perverting it into something it wasn't. And I can't say I blame him.
No, because what it was before that was good, was noble, was right, and was not associated with any sort of racial superiority concept.
Right.
And notice he refers to this Nordic nonsense.
Oh,
Tolkien hated the word Nordic. There was an interview in 1966. He was interviewed by this couple for the Daily Telegraph magazine. They sent him a draft of their article for his comments in early 1967. At one point in their article, they stated that, at least in the draft of their article, they stated that Middle-earth corresponds spiritually to Nordic Europe. And in his response to them in February of 1967, this was letter 294, he said, "Not Nordic, please, a word I personally dislike. It is associated, though of French origin, with racialist theories. Geographically, northern is usually better." So there you go.
Yeah, and I note that was 1967, so that was 22 years after Hitler's death.
Oh yeah,
and obviously this still affected him. This use of this word Nordic and its association with racist ideologies. That to me speaks volumes in regards to proving that Tolkien himself had no ideas like that in his head.
Right, he had the opposite ideas.
Yeah, he did. Later in that same letter, he actually he goes on more at length about how he's not all about northern things. He actually says, W.H. Auden has asserted that for me, the north is a sacred direction. That is not true. The northwest of Europe, where I and most of my ancestors have lived, has my affection, as a man's home should. I love its atmosphere, and know more of its histories and languages than I do of other parts. But it is not sacred, nor does it exhaust my affections. I have, for instance, a particular love for the Latin language, and among its descendants for Spanish. That it is untrue for my story, a mere reading of the synopses should show. The north was the seat of the fortresses of the devil.
That's a good point. I mean, granted, back in 1967, nobody had the ability to read the Silmarillion and understand what he's talking about, but we know. I mean, the fact is, Morgoth always had his fortresses in the north, a Tumno and an Angband.
Yep.
So, the idea that, his claim here that the north was the seat of the fortresses of the devil, that's absolutely
sacred.
true.
Yeah, absolutely untrue. Yeah.
Well, and I also have to say, I think calling anything sacred to Tolkien would have been insulting because of his own beliefs of what really truly was sacred.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Anything outside of that can't qualify as sacred. And
calling anything worldly sacred would have been alien to Tolkien.
Yeah, it really would have been. But that's a whole different conversation, isn't it? I'm sure we'll have that talk on a very special Patreon special in the future. But yeah, so we should be careful about jumping quickly to any assumption that Tolkien is engaging in some sort of pro-northern propaganda when we know that the North is actually where some very bad things happen.
Yes, very much so. Well, let's see. I think we probably said all we can about Tolkien's views on the Nazis and their usual set of talking points.
Yeah, but it's some good stuff to say. It was good.
Yeah, it was, and we had some fun with it. It's always great to see somebody of intelligence take down Adolf Hitler. So that was nice. I think we do need to spend a little time on Tolkien's thoughts about South Africa.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Tolkien was very young when he left South Africa, and he never returned in his life.
Yeah.
But his mother, Mabel, had very strong opinions about the racial problems in South Africa that she seems to have passed on to her sons.
As longtime listeners know, Christopher Tolkien was stationed in South Africa in 1944 while training for the Royal Air Force. He wrote his father a letter in which he apparently made some remarks about the troubling local racial problems. Now, we don't have that letter, but we do have Tolkien's response as letter number 61, in which he said to Christopher, "As for what you say or hint of local conditions, I knew of them. I don't think they have much changed, even for the worse. I used to hear them discussed by my mother, and have ever since taken a special interest in that part of the world. The treatment of color nearly always horrifies anyone going out from Britain, and not only in South Africa. Unfortunately, not many retain that generous sentiment for long." Wow.
Yeah, that's
really,
that's sad. I mean, there's a very interesting comment at the end there about how people coming out from Britain to other parts of the world, not just South Africa, but other parts of the world, just they're always horrified by racial relations that they see in other parts of the world, and then they just don't learn from it.
Yeah.
They don't retain that
Yeah.
generous sentiment for long. They forget about it. They move on to other things.
And he definitely judges that. I mean, he criticizes that,
absolutely.
which tells us something about his own beliefs, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, that's clearly something that he was saddened by, and that he wished that his countrymen could do better.
Or more, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think it's obviously clear from that Tolkien's mother Mabel taught him tolerance. She obviously spent some time, even though they were no longer there, she spent some time talking to her children about what it was like there, and that it was wrong. And I think that's important. I think we really need to address that.
And anything his mother taught him, he held deeply.
He did. That's right.
For the rest of his life, he valued what she taught him. No doubt.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've probably have understated on this show the effect she had on him throughout his life.
Yeah, I don't think we've talked enough about that.
No.
I mean, I haven't gone back to episode 1 in a while, but I'm sure our biographical material, we didn't talk about just how important Mabel was to him.
No, I agree. Well, something to correct in future episodes.
Yeah, maybe in a Tolkien fun fact. Well, not exactly fun.
It wouldn't be that fun, but
maybe this day of Tolkien history.
There's a lot of great stuff that she passed on to him, and I think that's important.
Absolutely.
There are some additional stories about Mabel's tolerance while she was living in South Africa. Humphrey Carpenter's biography has some of this, and we did talk about a little bit of this back in episode 71, and it wasn't a Tolkien fun fact. As a white collar British family living in South Africa in the 1890s, the Tolkiens did have black servants working for them, Native African servants working for them.
Sure.
So Carpenter says Mabel found the Boer attitude to the natives objectionable, and the Boers are the white Dutch settlers who lived there.
Right.
She found their attitude to the natives objectionable, and in Bankhouse, which is the Tolkien's home, there was tolerance, most notably over the extraordinary behavior of the houseboy Isaac, who one day stole little John Ronald Ruel. Yeah. One day he stole little John Ronald Ruel and took him to his kraal, which is a traditional African village of huts, where he showed off with pride the novelty of a white baby. It upset
white baby.
I know, right? I know. It upset everybody and caused a great turmoil. But Isaac was not dismissed, and in gratitude, he named his own son Isaac Mr. Tolkien Victor, in honor of his employees and Queen Victoria.
Who had done absolutely nothing for him, but
No, that's true. Obviously, a pro-British bent in the household.
Yes, very much so. But I love that. I can just imagine him holding, like, look at this. Wow.
Look at this. Check this out,
He's
guys.
so white.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it certainly would upset everybody, but I love that they didn't fire him,
over the abduction of their child.
Over the kidnapping of their son.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks volumes again.
I got better.
I mean, it just speaks volumes to the tolerance that they had.
It really does. And so does, there's a picture in the biography too that speaks to that as well. It's the Tolkien family Christmas card in 1892.
Oh, yeah, I know this one.
Yeah, so we see Arthur and Mabel. We see Tolkien, who's a little less than a year old at that point, in the arms of his nurse. And then we see two people of color. We see Isaac and a maid. And in Carpenter's words, both looking pleased and a little surprised to be included in the photograph.
That's right, yeah.
Now, the exhibition catalog for Tolkien Maker of Middle-earth, which, by the way, you need to go see. If you haven't seen it in Oxford, go see it in Oxford, but it'll also be in New York early next year.
Mm-hmm.
The exhibition includes a much bigger and more detailed image of this Christmas card, and it includes a very specific comment that to include the household servants who were people of color in the family Christmas card was very unusual for the time.
That's right. I remember seeing that, and it is a beautiful blow up of the photograph in that book. Yeah. Well, so hopefully we've sufficiently made the case that Tolkien, despite living in very racially divided times, was somewhat more enlightened in regards to race and racial issues than many of his contemporaries. And I think he owed a lot of that to his upbringing, to his education, and I think he does deserve some credit for that.
Yeah, but we did promise to be objective. And despite the fact that Tolkien himself was clearly not a racist, he did at times use language that we would not use today. In that same letter to Christopher, where he talked about the treatment of the South African natives and was, very disappointed in that, Tolkien unfortunately used the word Chinaman.
Yeah, he does. And Dimitra Fimi also, includes a story in her book about a debate Tolkien took part in. Now, this would have been when he was just 19 at King Edward's School. Not that absolves him, but
Well,
he was a
no.
young man. Tolkien was in this debate, and he was arguing that the works attributed to William Shakespeare were written by Francis Bacon, which is hilarious, and is a sign that, this was a debate that nobody was taking too seriously.
Right.
But one of Tolkien's arguments was basically attacking Shakespeare's, and I'm quoting here, his filthy birthplace, his squalid surroundings, and his sordid character. And he argued that to believe that so great a genius arose in such circumstances commits us to the belief that a fair-haired European infant could have a woolly-haired prognathous Papuan parent.
Oh, wow.
That is definitely a shocking thing to read to us. Fimi points out that at the time it was a natural thing to say. It was backed, not only by contemporary popular ideas and stereotypes, some of the stuff we've talked about, the racial anthropology of the time,
right,
but also by science.
Right.
But I would also point out that,
that was,
Dr.
as
Fimi,
we said before, common knowledge.
That
right?
was common knowledge. And when he was
incorrect.
19 and in school, that's the stuff he was probably learning in school.
Right. Right.
More in Tolkien's defense, I would say, Fimi also pointed out that those offensive words, and prognathous is a word for a protruding jaw, that was associated with the time of people of African descent. Fimi points out that word comes, that whole sentence,
that whole
basically,
phrase,
that whole phrase comes almost word for word from the work of a sociologist named Herbert Spencer. It sounds to me like this is probably something Tolkien had read for school. Maybe he'd even learned it in a lecture, and he's probably bringing it up as an inside joke for his schoolmates.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Again, I'm not saying that it's okay for him to use this kind of stuff. But I think what we need to keep in mind is, these kinds of statements, as shocking and as offensive as they may be to us today, rightfully so, they do not prove that Tolkien was a racist. They prove is that he was a man of his day who used the language of his day to talk about the world of his day. I mean, we all use the language available to us.
Yeah.
Even those of us who now live in what we believe to be the more enlightened 21st century use the language that's available to us. And who knows what people are going to say about our language in 100 years.
That's right. The language will be different in 20 years, let alone in 50 or 100.
Yeah.
And they'll look back at some of the words we used and really, people use that word? I mean, that's terrible. Well,
exactly.
It's what we have. It's what he had, and that's important.
Yeah.
So we've spent a lot of time now talking about Tolkien himself, but what about his work? Maybe it would be good for us to spend some time now talking about some of the attributes and characteristics of different races in Middle-earth itself that lead some to the charges of racism. And we're going to start with dwarves or anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Now, hopefully this will be a quick one, because we've already talked about Tolkien's views on the Jewish people themselves, based on his reference to them as a gifted people in his letter to those German publishers. I don't think that if there were any similarity between dwarves and Jews, I don't think that we should necessarily see that as a bad thing.
No. I mean, Tolkien did actually say in one letter, I do, and this was to his daughter. So, we talk about reading the letters in context.
Right. Yeah.
When he writes to his kids, he's being honest. I do think of the dwarves like Jews, at once native and alien in their habitations, speaking the languages of the country, but with an accent due to their own private tongue. Now that's letter 176. But you got to note, his comparison is a linguistic one, and to some degree a cultural one. It is not a racial one.
Yeah, and I think that linguistic comparison, again, is important. We talked about that already.
Right.
And this is going to be a little bit word nerdy, but according to
Tolkien
word linguists,
Good.
You got to get a little bit of that in here today. According to some Tolkien linguists like Helga Fausganger, who's the scholar behind the website Artalambion, which is a fantastic website.
Okay, that's enough word nerdery right there. Right there. Just Fausganger and Artalambion.
Just mention Fausganger and Artalambion. It's probably the best website out there for Tolkien's languages.
Yeah, agreed.
He's written that the dwarvish language of Khuzdul does resemble the Semitic languages. And by Semitic languages, I mean Hebrew and Arabic, and I got to say Maltese just because my mother-in-law is Maltese. Hi, Maria.
Oh.
But Khuzdul does resemble the Semitic languages in sound and structure. Uber word nerdy here. But I know some of our listeners are fluent in Hebrew or Arabic. The Semitic languages form words using roots of 3 consonants, triconsonantal roots. You get a root of 3 letters that are usually consonants that mean a basic semantic concept like peace or right, WRITE. And then by adding different vowels to that, like you add different vowels to the root for right, and then you get things related to that. Like you get the word for writer, or a word for book, or a word for desk.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Kuzdul, according to Faustgänger, actually works the same way. It's got that same structure. So it doesn't just sound like Hebrew. It is actually built like Hebrew is.
That's fascinating. But, even aside from that linguistic inspiration and the cultural idea of a people in diaspora, there isn't anything to suggest that the dwarves are actually supposed to be a stand-in for Jews, despite there being some connections. Any attempt to link dwarvish characteristics with anti-Semitic stereotypes just falls apart, because there's nothing bad about dwarves that some other group in Middle-earth doesn't share as well. I mean, greedy? Yes. Dwarvish hearts and dragon gold, that's a bad mix. But like we talked about in The Hobbit, the Cinder and Elven King and the humans of Lake Town were just as greedy for that gold as Thorin was. And the truth is, even Dine, or Dane, however you want to call him, was less greedy than they all were, I might add.
Yeah, that's a good point. And honestly, I mean, the Silmarillion is wall to wall filled with greedy elves, from Feanor to Thingol. I mean, that whole idea of possessive love, that love not too well the work of thy hands. I mean, that's not a dwarvish trait.
No.
That's just a Tolkien thing. I mean, most of his villains have that trait in some way.
Absolutely.
I don't even want to bring this one up again, but since I mentioned it once already, I have to just put this silly big noses thing to rest. I've searched the text, folks. Fili is the only dwarf in The Hobbit who's said to have a long nose. It's longer than the other dwarves' noses, because we know that because Fili could breathe when he was wrapped in the spider webs, and the others couldn't.
That's right.
But that's the only place that comes from. So whoever is spreading that rumor that dwarves have big noses and that's an anti-Semitic thing, it needs to stop.
Yeah,
it's just not there.
It really does. You're right, because the other references to big noses in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the only other ones are to Denethor and Gandalf.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So
there's nothing there.
Show me where in the text you see that, if you see that somewhere, please, somebody.
Absolutely.
But the next one is a bit concerning, and I think we do need to spend some time on it. And this is the idea that, the bad guys are all dark-skinned or slant-eyed.
Yeah.
And, if we start with the orcs, I'll admit that the description of the orcs is a bit problematic. They're described in various places as swart, which means dark-skinned or black-skinned. There's an orc in Moria in Fellowship of the Ring. It says his broad, flat face was swart. His eyes were like coals.
Mm-hmm.
They were described as slant-eyed twice in the Two Towers. The Uruk-hai are called swart and slant-eyed twice in Two Towers. Once when Boromir has just been killed, and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are searching for signs of Merry and Pippin. And then once later when we're actually with Merry and Pippin with the Uruk-hai, that description comes up again.
Right, and then squint-eyed appears in all 3 volumes of Lord of the Rings, and that's always in reference to men who are described as having orc-like features, like Bill Ferny's friend in Bree. Merry says this very explicitly in The Two Towers. He says, most of them were ordinary men, rather tall and dark-haired, and grim but not particularly evil-looking. But there were some others that were horrible, man-high but with goblin faces, sallow, leering, squint-eyed. Do you know they reminded me at once of that southerner at Bree? Only he was not so obviously orc-like as most of these were. That's pretty troubling. There's also an orc dagger that Gimli finds in the pile of bodies that has, quote, a hideous head with squinting eyes and leering mouth.
Mm-hmm. And I'll admit, I mean, those are all pretty troubling choices of words, and they're all hard to read, especially when you read them back to back like that, when you read them all.
Well, yeah, through this lens, right, exactly.
Yeah. But I do want to keep 2 things in mind. First of all, the references to slant eyes or squint eyes, after you know the whole story of Lord of the Rings, you understand that this is referring to men who have been bred with orcs. It's not a reference to a particular human feature or any particular, ethnic feature of any human group. When I read this, I don't think of epicanthic folds, which, by the way, are not limited to people from East Asia. They are found in some groups of Northern Europeans as well. And you can look that up if you don't believe me. I don't think he's describing a feature that any human phenotype has. Honestly, when I read this, I'm thinking of the Gamorrean guards from Return of the Jedi. The guards in Jabba's palace. I mean, I'm thinking of a monster.
Yes.
I'm not thinking of any kind of human group.
And that's a good point, because as we'll get to with this next bit, monster is a great way to go with this, because the reference to swart, at least in reference to orcs, does seem to be a trope from literature that Tolkien's referencing. In Ring of Words, there's an entry for Silharos, which is a derivation from Old English Seal Heroin. I hope I got that right.
Sounds
Which
right.
I think I did. Seal Heroin, which had traditionally been translated previously as Ethiopians. Now, okay, we're not off to a great start. But that Tolkien believed, according to a paper on the word that he published both in 1932 and in 1934, he believed that the word actually meant something different. He thought it meant, and I'm quoting here, an established type of being from northern mythology, namely a creature with a soot-black face and red-hot eyes that shed sparks. Now, this sounds so much like the description of the Moria orc we just read a moment ago. Swart face, eyes like coals.
Yep.
I've got to conclude Tolkien doesn't mean the orc is black-skinned the way a human might be, but that it is actually literally black with red eyes like a monster or demon.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that word, seal heroin, it had been translated by scholars as Ethiopians in the past, and Tolkien did consider using the word Silharos for the Haradrim, which we'll get to in a minute when we talk about men. But he did not. I cannot stress that enough.
That's huge.
It is huge, and I think the conclusion has to be that he had second thoughts about that. He decided he did not want to use that word for a dark-skinned race of men because he believed it didn't really mean that. He believed it was a monster.
Yep.
And I think we need to remember that. That article that I mentioned earlier, why is the only good orc a dead orc? That kind of points out the fact that, well, the reason for that is because orcs are monsters. They're not humans. They began as elves, and maybe some of them began as men. I know that's kind of up for debate. But they have
depending
been
on which origin story,
right?
Which origin story you buy,
right. But they have been corrupted so thoroughly by Morgoth and by Sauron or Sauron that they are now beyond any humanity. They're beyond any hope of being good. Their physical form is meant to reflect corruption inside in their souls.
Yeah.
And that is what Tolkien is trying to establish. He's trying to establish a physical form that is ugly, that is twisted, that's corrupted and inhuman. And yes, that is somewhat subjective, but I think it has to be.
Sure.
And so I think any dark skin or any facial feature that he describes in pursuit of that is something that's well beyond the range of what human beings exhibit of any race.
Right. Exactly. I concur. And, one last comment on some of the physical features of orcs that we haven't really talked about, but I think is informative. This comes from the Patrick Curry book that you mentioned earlier. He points out that Tolkien's description of orcs actually are a reference to medieval literature in another way. He says, orcs sound very like the first horrified reports in Europe of the invading Huns in the 4th and 5th centuries. Broad-shouldered, bow-legged, devilishly effective fighters, moving fast, talking a language that sounds like no human speech, and practicing ghastly tortures with great relish.
That's a good catch, and I think it's worth pointing out that based on what we know of the way Tolkien worked, he was probably far more likely to be referencing an old literary trope from medieval literature than he was to be referencing any kind of current events or real-world ethnicity.
Sure.
I mean, if you've ever read some medieval literature, I'm thinking specifically of the Song of Roland.
Oh,
you know just how racist some of it can be. I mean, I remember reading that Song of Roland and just being shocked by, some of the things it said about Muslims, and it is truly shocking stuff. And obviously that applied to Huns being described in European literature. I guess I would say this, at least Tolkien gives these inhuman characteristics to actual inhuman creatures, instead of spreading lies or stereotypes about a real ethnicity or a real religion. He's creating these
giving
monsters.
Monstrous descriptions to actual monsters.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's significant. So we've touched on orcs, and now it's about men. What about the evil men in the Legendarium? How are they described? Well, Easterlings don't seem to be described in Lord of the Rings at all. They are described in the Silmarillion. Their skins were swart or sallow, and their hair was as dark as their eyes. They're also called the swarthy men, and swarthy is another word for dark-skinned that's related to swart. So we are looking at what seems to be a different race here, or at least a different ethnicity. If we're using our own terminology correctly, it's worth noting though that they're not all evil in the First Age. I mean, we got to remember there were two major houses of Easterlings mentioned in the Silmarillion, one led by Bor and the other by Ulfang. Both of them swore oaths to the sons of Feanor. Ulfang betrayed Caranthir, but Bor and his sons remained loyal.
Right.
And as we discussed all the way back in season 1, it's believed that their descendants ended up becoming the snowmen of Foreshell, the Losoth. Now,
That's right.
now, the fact that half of the named Easterlings are evil and half aren't, it doesn't prove anything. We can easily count more flat-out evil elves in the Silmarillion than Ulfang and his three sons, Feanor, Celeborn, Curufin, Eol, Myglin.
That pretty much does it.
That's already more.
Yeah.
That's already more than Ulfang and three sons, isn't it?
Right, exactly, yeah. My three sons with Ulfang. No. Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah.
So that's the Easterlings. That's really about all we get on the Easterlings.
Yeah, there isn't much.
The Haradrim, or the Southrons in the Third Age, they are more clearly described as dark-skinned.
They are.
There's a line in Return of the King that says, "Out of far Harad, black men like half trolls with white eyes and red tongues." That's a difficult one to read.
Yeah, it is.
Sam actually says that the name for the Haradrim in the Shire is Swertings, which is clearly derived from the word swart as a reference to their dark skin. Ring of Words actually offers an interesting history of the word swerting, though. It says, "Swerting has a precedent in Beowulf, where a person named Swerting is mentioned in passing, and in Old Norse literature, which mentions a man named Sverting and a family called the Svertingar, which is the plural of that, though in these cases there is no suggestion that these people are foreigners." Well,
interesting.
I think it is likely that Tolkien was probably thinking of this Swerting from Beowulf when he wrote Lord of the Rings. I don't think that changes the fact that Tolkien's Swertings were foreigners and they were dark-skinned.
Yeah, and they also uniformly fight on the side of Sauron. But remember that famous, and I got to say, beautiful passage from the Two Towers when Sam sees the body of that Haradrim soldier, and here's the quote. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. Oh man, that's beautiful.
That's such a great moment.
It really is. It really is. And I can't help but think that this moment of compassion for the fallen man really must echo an experience that Tolkien had on the Somme time after time, looking at the face
I'm sure he must
of
have
a fallen enemy. Yeah. It's a very, very powerful moment, and it really is the closest look we get at one of the Haradrim. I don't think it's an accident. Orcs are never described in these terms, are they?
No, they are not.
Fallen orcs are never described in sympathetic terms like this. Tolkien clearly, though, wants us to have sympathy for this fallen foreigner who just happens to be a person of color.
That's true. And I think even though it's only Sam speculating in sort of his inner monologue that he may have been lied to, or that, this Haradrim soldier may have been lied to or threatened to go to war, and speculating that he might rather have stayed home, I don't think there's a person reading Lord of the Rings who doesn't believe that's true.
Yeah, you're right.
I think we all, we read that, we look into that soldier's face and we think, yes, that's absolutely what happened. And the conclusion that we have to draw from that, I think, is that, the rank and file Haradrim, Tolkien is saying, they're not evil. Their leaders may be evil. They may be, puppets for Sauron, or maybe they're slaves. But the men doing the fighting, the men actually out there doing the fighting, are not evil individuals. And I think Tolkien wants us to be acutely aware of that.
I think you're right, because Aragorn makes peace with the Easterlings and the Haradrim. He doesn't make peace with the orcs. That cannot be.
Right.
But peace with the Easterlings and Haradrim can be made. Why? Because they're not evil, and Aragorn knows that. There's a quote that says, "And the king pardoned the Easterlings that had given themselves up and sent them away free. And he made peace with the peoples of Harad. And the slaves of Mordor he released, and gave to them all the lands about Lake Nurnen to be their own."
Yeah, that's right. You put that together with Sam's observation of the fallen soldier, and the picture that emerges is that Easterlings and Haradrim are not evil.
Right. Not like orcs, no.
Not like orcs. And people of different races can live together in peace and harmony. The conflict between ethnicities comes from Sauron.
Yeah,
it is an evil. The conflict between ethnicities is an evil thing that comes from Sauron.
That really is well put, and it's something that I don't think is grasped on first read. So I'm glad we were able to kind of put that together and see the difference between how orcs are treated versus how the evil men are treated.
Yeah,
and how their ethnicity has nothing to do with the evil in this case. So, but speaking of evil and speaking of ethnicity, white men can be evil too. We talk about the black Númenóreans. Now, let's be clear. The text always indicates they're black in the sense of being evil. This is not that they're suddenly a different race. These are Númenóreans. I mean, we know that they have the lineage of the Edain, of course, the best of all men. But like many of the Númenóreans ended up being, they're evil. And they're so evil that one of them ends up becoming the mouth of Sauron.
Yes, that is true.
I mean,
that is very true. That is true.
You might be evil.
If your name is the mouth of Sauron, you might be a black
evil.
Númenorian. Let's see, what else do we have? I mean, we've got the Dunlendings. I mean, we don't know a ton about the Dunlendings, but they were descended from one of the houses of the Edain. Actually, in Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien says that they were descended from the house of Haleth.
That's right.
They are said to be swarthy, and that makes me wonder if maybe, well, a couple things I'm thinking about this. I wonder if maybe when Tolkien says swarthy, that maybe means something a little different from swart.
Maybe.
I don't know what the difference would be, and maybe that remains open to interpretation. But maybe there's something there. Or maybe there's a possibility that the Edain were just more racially diverse than we usually assume they were.
That's a good point.
In which case, I think that might be something in Tolkien's corner. In fact,
yeah.
I would say the Edain were more racially diverse than we usually assume, because according to Unfinished Tales, remember the Woses, the Druedain.
Oh, the Druedain, right.
They came into the West with the folk of Haleth. And
that's right.
And in fact, their name even has Edain in it, Druedain.
Yeah, Druedain. Yeah.
And I know we've got some stuff on them a little bit later to talk about. But I think a lot of times our assumptions about the text, our assumptions about what Tolkien as a white man in the first part of the 20th century would want to say, our assumptions about that can be dangerous. We haven't talked much about David Day on the podcast.
For good reason.
Yeah, if folks don't know David Day's work, he's the author of numerous books on Tolkien.
He writes one book with about 17 different titles.
With 17 different titles that he's repackaged and republished. And it's all these like little encyclopedias and things, these alphabetical listings, and
right.
And they're widely criticized for making stuff up, which they do.
Yeah.
And also for like you just said, Alan, for reusing material from books he's already published. I've actually heard some members of the Tolkien Society say the only thing that his books are good for is the illustrations.
Well, that's not true. They're also good as doorstops.
Very true. Very true. I would say even the illustrations are off sometimes. I have one of his books that I picked up when I was a teenager, before I knew better. And this was not long after I first read Lord of the Rings. In that book, there's a picture of the Varyags of Khand.
Ooh, and I wonder how many people even remember the Varyags of Khand. I mean,
right.
They're mentioned like twice, right? Alongside Easterlings and Southrons, but I don't know that we ever really see them. We certainly know virtually nothing about them, except they come from Khand, which is just southeast of Mordor, somewhere near Harad.
Right. That's it. I mean, they're mentioned.
Yeah, that's literally the sum of all our knowledge.
No description. They're just listed alongside. It's like a list of races or of groups, I guess.
So what about Day's book though with the Varyags?
So
what did he come up with?
So in this Day book, the picture of the Varyags of Khand is very clearly based on what I'll just politely call an Asian stereotype. It's actually pretty offensive.
Okay.
I'm guessing that the illustrator assumed that because the word Khand sounds vaguely Central Asian, maybe it sounds like Genghis Khan or Samarkand or something like that. They've inferred that the Varyags must be like Mongols, and that's basically what they've drawn them as. Huh. It's pretty horrible. And I guess that might be a valid assumption, except for the fact that I learned this much later in life. Varyag is actually the Slavic word for Viking.
Oh my.
Now, does that mean that the Varyags are blonde Scandinavian types? No, we just don't know because there's no description. No. But my point is that, we make these assumptions of what Tolkien is going for. And we shouldn't. There's no reason to assume that they're supposed to look foreign because Tolkien was obviously at least thinking of Vikings when he called them Varyags.
Certainly.
So,
my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've probably talked about all the bad guys now. It's probably time to talk about the other accusation sometimes that's thrown out there, and that's that the good guys are all white. Truth is, this is a tough one because there's really not much to set against it.
Yeah, that's true.
Aside from the wild men, whom we only really see briefly in Return of the King and in one of the essays in Unfinished Tales, it does appear that virtually all the good guys do match the traditional, white European phenotype.
Yeah, and the wild men are an exception. The Woses or the Druedain, they are good. But to be fair, there's some troubling aspects to the way they're described.
Sure,
Dimitra Fimi observes that they're given childlike characteristics, just the way they're described as being hairless below their eyebrows, save only a few.
I'd forgotten about that, yeah.
Yeah, save only a few who were proud to have a small tail of black hair in the midst of the chin. And they're described as their laughter is rich and rolling as one would expect a child's laughter to be. And you know what Fimi points out is that Tolkien seems to be channeling this literary trope of the noble savage in his depiction of the Woses.
Yeah.
It's this idea of a primitive man, and these are Fimi's words, a primitive man who is free, peaceful, and close to nature. Fimi actually quotes an essay by Verlin Flieger, who pointed out that Gonburi Gon's dialogue sounds like that of a Hollywood Tarzan.
Boy, it sure does, actually, now that she points that out.
Yeah.
I wonder if Gone, Barry, Gone just means George of the Jungle. But
friend to you and me.
Oh, I used to watch that show when I was a little guy on Channel 5 in L.A.
Well, it is a good point, though, that, that stuff is still out there in pop culture, isn't it?
Yeah. It is.
This Tarzan trope is still out there.
Very much so. Well, again, as a product of his time, Tolkien was working from a trope that appeared in popular literature of the day, like you just said. And also in medieval literature, too. Both Ring of Words and Tom Shippey have some really interesting stuff to say about wild men or woodwoses in medieval literature.
Oh, yeah.
But credit where credit's due. Fimi says that Tolkien's noble savages, the Woses, are unlovely in appearance rather than exotically beautiful, but they're still romanticized. Their primitiveness is respected rather than despised.
Yeah. So there's that, and I guess you can make of that what you will. But they are there on the side of good. As for the other good guys, we've talked about the dwarves already.
Right.
Elves. Yeah. Elves are always fair and beautiful, but I mean, come on, that's traditional and folklore. Yeah. It's also potentially a matter of philology for Tolkien. Scholars aren't really totally sure about the etymology of the word elf, but one possibility is that it could be related to Indo-European words meaning white. Things like the Latin word albus.
Okay, yeah.
Elves. So, elves are beautiful, and elves are very pale-skinned.
By definition, right?
Yeah.
We talk a lot about ennoblement or embiggening, and the idea that the only real claim to nobility among the Dunedain was the fact that they had elvish blood. That comes from letter 144. But although Tolkien couches this in terms of bloodline, for him it's really much more of a spiritual concept. Tolkien uses the word ennoblement many times in his letters, and it's not always about the men who have elvish blood. He talks about the ennoblement of the ignoble in letter 165. He also talks about the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble in letter 181. Both of those are key themes in The Lord of the Rings. What's interesting about that last one especially is the use of sanctification as a synonym for ennoblement. Yeah. That really shows you where he's going with this. I mean, especially given his worldview, his understanding, his beliefs, theologically speaking. This is much more of a spiritual term. It's a term about enlightenment and wisdom, far more so than it is about elvish blood in the line.
I think you're right. And I think that, I'd even argue that the first ennoblement of men is probably their contact with Finrod that happens in the Silmarillion. It's long before Beren and Luthien meet. They get ennobled just by meeting Finrod and learning from him. So I would say that it is not purely a racial or a genetic concept. Tolkien even says in his letters, hobbits are ennobled by their actions, by contact with the other peoples of Middle-earth and by rising up to do great deeds. Although I think it's probably fair to point out that to the extent that ennoblement may be a racial or a genetic concept, it's a multiracial one, isn't it? I mean,
you're right.
The men with the quote unquote the highest blood, the most ennobled blood, are those who are of mingled race. They're the ones who are descended from both elves and men.
You're right. Aragorn and all the line of Elros. Even the princes of Dol Amroth. Yes, we're finally leaning into that one.
We admit we were wrong. Yeah.
This is the Corrigenda again.
Yes, exactly.
The Prancing Pony Podcast.
Exactly.
Your boy Eärendil, of course.
Of course.
And even Luthien is of mixed race. She's Elven and Maya.
Yeah, and frankly, I actually have lots of ideas about Eärendil as a biracial hero that, unfortunately, I don't think we have time to get into because we've gone long enough. But maybe they'll make their way into a Prancing Pony Pondering someday.
I'm sure they will, given your interest in Eärendil and the fact that we have 7 years left.
That is a very polite word for my obsession with Eärendil. Thank you.
There were just air quotes around that, just so you know.
One more just comment on this idea of mixed race marriages and Luthien. I have to say, I'm thinking back to the way Thingol treats Beren when they first meet.
Hideous.
I kind of feel like we understated this when we talked about it on the show. I think that might be the most bigoted thing we see in the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
I mean, remember when Thingol's words to Luthien are, "Shall such as these lay hands on you and yet live?"
Yeah.
He's saying that about Beren. And he's saying that to his
Beren,
daughter. And
Beren, who is the son of Barahir and who's done great things. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Thingol says that to his daughter. And I'm going to share something very ugly for a moment, but I grew up in a place in the South that had its fair share of racial problems. And I do remember hearing white men say almost those exact same words about white girls who dated men of color more than once when I was growing up. And I cannot help but think of that when I read those words by Thingol.
You're right. Well, there is a reason we called that episode "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner."
Yeah, that's true.
And, there's for very good reason. But clearly, Thingol, with his overt racism, is on the wrong side of history here. Tolkien makes a moral judgment on this character and shows Thingol's actions for what they are: an act of prejudice that's morally wrong, according to Eru himself.
That's right, because Beren and Luthien are meant to be together. That's part of the divine plan.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're MFEO. Made for each other. There's your Sleepless in Seattle reference, the only one that'll ever be made.
Wow. I haven't seen that movie since the one time I watched it, 20 years ago?
Well, yeah, don't ever watch it again. It's really not worth it. But I
That's
just
funny.
remembered we picked that line up. Yeah. So what have we learned here? Obviously, Tolkien was a man of his time. Some of his language does not measure up to our modern standards of language about race. He uses some words and shows us some depictions that, frankly, we're going to be a little uncomfortable with. But we have to take those troubling aspects of the work in the context of his time and also of the literary tradition that he was emulating.
Yeah, and I think we also have to balance these concerning aspects of the text, these problems with the text, which is what they really are, with the overall message. And the overall message of the text is there is a strong theme that we keep coming back to on the podcast, which is the various peoples of Middle-earth working together to defeat the forces of evil. It is a multicultural message. It's not as literal a multicultural message as we might hope for in our modern age. Today, inclusion and representation are things that we value, and rightly so.
Yeah.
But I still say that for his time, I think Tolkien does pretty well on the racial sensitivity scale. Not perfect, but I think he does better than some of his contemporaries. And for that, I think he deserves credit.
Yeah, I would even say more than some.
More than some. Yeah, many. You're right.
Probably more than most.
Certainly from the picture that emerges from his letters and just putting all that stuff in context, I think he does.
Yeah.
And for that, I believe he deserves some credit. And frankly, I don't think he deserves the correlation that some people make between him and these racist ideologies.
I agree. As we like to remind ourselves, the Legendarium is not an allegory. It's important to remember when we start to talk about this kind of issue, because though he was inspired by real world concepts and events, myths and stories, and of course languages, he didn't have hidden messages in this work. I mean, maybe there's some hidden messages in Leaf by Niggle, but there's nothing there.
Sure, yeah.
That's an allegory.
And things
on its
like
face,
the Tower allegory and stuff like that.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. But in Lord of the Rings, in the Legendarium, no, there's nothing in the Legendarium that's an allegory.
No, and I guess the sad truth is that people who read his work can read whatever they want to into it. I mean, that's true. That's the whole thing about applicability. Yep. And that is a double-edged sword that allows readers to interpret the work in a way that fits with their values, whatever they are. I mean, come on, people can even read Feanor as a hero. How much mail have we gotten about that?
Man.
Or at least an anti-hero, I guess.
Sure.
People can even read Melkor as an anti-hero.
Yeah, crazy.
So, and obviously that's not there.
No, but in our opinion, as the humble hosts of the Prancing Pony Podcast, those kinds of readings into Tolkien's work, frankly, they reveal more about the reader than they do about the writer.
That is very well said. So while we can't ever really know what was in Tolkien's mind while he was writing, we can read what he wrote and we can examine it in the context of his words, both outside of his fiction and inside of his fiction, and also in context of the life that he lived. And we can try and make a determination from that information about how he might have felt about white supremacist groups, neo-Nazis, and others who are out there using his work to promote their own racist ideologies.
Yeah, I think we can make that determination pretty readily, yeah. Now, hopefully we've given folks enough information about this topic to feel a bit more informed, and hopefully put some minds at ease about Tolkien's intentions. Maybe we've even given you a little ammunition for the next argument you have with someone about whether or not Tolkien was racist.
We hope so. That's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
Obviously, hopefully our treatment of this topic has kind of shown the fact that this is a really important topic to both of us.
Yeah.
And we want your feedback on how we've handled it. If we did a good job, we definitely want to know about that. If we could have done better, we absolutely want to know that we could have done better.
Especially if Sean could have done better. Sorry. No,
Alan, you were fine, but that's Sean.
I kid. But yeah.
In all seriousness, we have tried to give this the attention and the seriousness that it deserved. We've tried to be as objective as possible. We've tried to think critically about the work. Even though it means so much to us, we've tried not to put it on a pedestal, and we've tried to be honest about it. And I mean, I would say I feel good about where we've landed on this. But we do want your feedback.
That's right. And one more thing, because it is such an important topic, if you like what we've done with it, we'd like to share it with the main feed at some point. Now, obviously, we want your input on that. You guys are our patrons. This special is part of your reward for your support. And it's part of the extra value that you get for being a member of the Fellowship of the Podcast. But we think this is a really important topic, and we think we've done some relatively solid work on it. So maybe in a few months, after you've had exclusive access for a while, we'd like to consider posting it to the main feed so the rest of our listeners can hear it as well. So please let us know what you think of that idea.
Yeah, please do. I mean, if it were any other topic in one of these specials, and obviously there have been many other topics we've addressed through these specials, we wouldn't think of asking you, how you feel about us sharing those to the main feed. That those are yours as a patron.
Yep.
But for this one, we do feel like it may be worth sharing more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tamsin, thank you for suggesting such an important topic to us and trusting us to give it the treatment that it deserves. I hope you feel like we've done a good job with it, and we want to hear from you and from everyone else listening, because this does wrap it up.
Indeed, that does wrap up the Prancing Pony Podcast Patreon special from last October. We hope it challenged you, as it did us, and we hope it made you think. But most of all, we hope you enjoyed it.
And as we said in the intro, we hope we've answered the question of Tolkien's intentions, but our goal was to start a conversation and not end it, so we'd love to hear from you. But in the meantime, please be sure to join us again next week as we get to stay for a while in the House of Tom Bombadil.
Thanks again for listening, and thank you for making our common room on Facebook such a fascinating place to spend time. We want all of you to be a part of this conversation, especially this conversation, and it really does not stop when the episode ends. See the comments, questions, corrections, and more on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdan's contribution tier: DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Emily in Texas, Chad in Texas, and especially Tamsin in Minnesota for today's topic. Thank you all.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts and comments, no witty closing gag tonight, to Bartleman at theprancingponypodcast.com. We'll try to get him into our next show. Well, an hour 35, hour 40, is still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.